Hi, everybody. My name is Yannis Katsaros, and today I'd like to spend a bit of your time to talk to you about my experience in building a dashboard for clinical trials. Before we begin, I'd just like to say a big thanks to Product Circle and for inviting me, and I sincerely hope that you'll find the next 20 minutes or so useful. This is me. I've been working for Medidata for the last 2.5 years. I've been working in the broader product management area for the last 7 years, and before that I was involved more on the R&D side of software delivery and software design. But the overarching element was always medical technology. So I'm a big fan of this space, and I really enjoy working in it. And Medidata recently gave me the opportunity to have a bigger impact in my role. What I'm going to be talking to you guys today about is a bit about Medidata, although other people in the Product Circle events have spoken about the company before, so I won't take too much time speaking on that. Given the current circumstances, I'd like to speak to you a bit more about the clinical trial space overall and the way that clinical trials are conducted. And then the remaining of the presentation is the before and after, with the milestone being the time that a product team is happy with the business requirements they have. I always felt that this is a major milestone in the software design process, and I've sort of classified the life cycle in the before and after of this milestone. So a bit about Medidata. So Medidata is a global player in the clinical trial software, and a statistic that speaks well to that is the fact that about half of the clinical trials that are currently run across the globe are in one form or another aided by Medidata software, and we as Medidata employees are very proud of that statistic. Just to get ourselves on the same page before we begin, I'd like us to understand what a clinical trial is. This is a definition that I found online, and I'm pretty happy with because it encapsulates the essence of a clinical trial. I'll let you read it, but the main perhaps takeaway from this and the number one priority on anyone working on a clinical trial is the safety of the patients involved. So I'll keep this as a theme in the remaining of the presentation, but I also want to make sure that you guys understand that anybody working in the space has this as their number one priority. In a typical clinical trial, if we had to group stakeholders into 4 groups, these would be them. So at the top there in green, you've got the pharmaceuticals, the biotech companies, the medical device manufacturers that are sponsoring the trial. These are the people that have invented, let's say, the experimental treatment or operation, and they intend to market it and make it available to the general public. In their journey, they are helped by that by organizations that are dedicated to conducting clinical trials. These are called CROs, or contract research organizations, and they are companies that do just that on behalf of the sponsors. A very important stakeholder is also all the people, all the medical personnel that are working on the hospitals, clinics, GP practices, or sites are there, as they are referred to, where the trial takes place. So these are very important because they are the ones that have the majority of the interaction with the patients, are also primarily responsible for the safety of the patients that are enrolled in the trial. And of course, in the center of this ecosystem is the patients themselves. So they are the ones who need to be recruited in order for the trial to take place, and they are the ones that are very, very central to any clinical trial for various reasons. If you see it from a software perspective, the patient is essentially the main source of data, right? So the majority of the data that is captured during a clinical trial is coming from the patients, and that essentially affects how software is built. So just to give you a very, very brief overview of the whole life cycle of a drug from the moment that is investigated in a small laboratory until it reaches the market. In the beginning, you've got the phase of the trial where experiments are done in vitro, in laboratory, and in animals sometimes. And these usually take anything from 4 to 5 years. And investigators need to prove that the drug is safe to be administered to humans before they even embark on the phase 1 of the clinical trial. So on that first phase, their primary objective is the safety of the humans that are participating, and so they're making sure that in low doses the drug that's being administered is safe. These are, as I said, fairly small scale. They last anything up to a year, from a few months to a year, and in terms of their success rate, about 60% of those move on to phase 2. In phase 2, this is where the investigators, the team, starts looking at the efficacy. How effective is the drug in treating the condition or the disease? These take up to 2 years, and they are the ones that actually fail the most, right? So if you see at the statistics, only 30% of phase 2 trials progress to phase 3. Phase 3 now is the longest of the phases. This is where the investigators start looking at the details of the effects of the drug. So this is where they are trying to establish that a drug is more effective than anything else that's out there in the market. And in order to achieve that, they need larger numbers of patients, and as you imagine, this is why this takes the longest. So of phase 3 trials, about 60% are submitted to approval to one of the regulatory bodies that decide if a drug is to reach the market or not, and that itself is a fairly long process. So unlike the vaccines for COVID-19, where they went through special conditions in the FDA to expedite their approval, normally drugs are the sponsors have to wait for up to a year and a half before they get an approval by the regulator. Overall, about 1 in 10 drugs that embark on a clinical trial reach the market. So that gives you a sense of how expensive the whole process is for the stakeholders. In terms of the software itself, it's an easy way to break it down, because there's a ton of tools out there. So an easy way to break it down is if you break down the software tools that are used in terms of the stage of the trial where they're being used for. So at the beginning, you've got your protocol design. The protocol is essentially the guideline of any clinical trial. It states the hypothesis, and dictates how the study should be conducted. It determines the amount of patients that need to be recruited before efficacy can be established. So this is essentially the Bible of any clinical trial. Following that, you've got software that deals with the study startup. This is the part where the sponsor or the CRO needs to recruit sites and medical personnel to help them get involved in the trial before even the trial starts. And then you've got the patient recruitment software. So this is the software that makes sure that all patients understand the risks involved in participating in a clinical trial. This is the software that deals with randomization and the various cohorts, etc. Following that, you've got clinical operations, which is the software that I am personally dealing with the most, and this has to do with the monitoring and management of a clinical trial. So this has more to do with the let's say the management of the trial and the making sure that the quality is maintained during all aspects of the trial. And you've got dry supply logistics. So in scenarios where you've got a trial that is run across 100 or 120 different hospitals, there needs to be software to support the supply of hospitals with the drug, keeping track of any shortage, making sure that the drug itself is transported in the right conditions, all kinds of things that have to do with that. And lastly, and probably the biggest part of this ecosystem of software tools is all the software that has to do with the collection of patient data, right? So as we said earlier, the patients are the main data source for any clinical trial. So you might imagine that for a trial that has run for 5, 6, 7, even 9 or 10 years for more complex oncology studies, the amount of data that patients generate is enormous. So there's a lot of effort going into building software like that. Before we get to the business requirements, how we got there, I'll try to make this as generic as possible to be more relevant to the people in the audience. But this is what essentially we have done in order to get to our first set of business requirements. So it's all about asking the right questions, and it's asking them frequently. So a mistake that we made early on was that we satisfied ourselves with one answer to some of those questions, and then we never asked it again. And as you might imagine, this boomerangs back to you at some stage later on in the journey. So these are the questions that, in retrospect, I wouldn't do without. And also, these are the questions that you need to keep asking yourself if you want to make sure that you're building the right thing. Let's kick off with how we approach those questions. So first off, who do you ask, right? So we're selling primarily to businesses. So getting access to users isn't always easy. So what we did is we made sure that we asked the right questions at the right times and to the right people. And we also utilized people in our own company that have better understanding of the industry. We refer to them as our subject matter experts, and we made sure that any major questions were addressed to them before we took them to our customers. That helped us get that early feedback, and that also helped us get that frequent feedback as well, right? Because you can't have customers in meetings every 2 weeks. It's simply impossible. What we also intended to do is to get as many people, be it customers or subject matter experts, as possible when we were asking those questions, right? So it was frequently the case where you had one person dominating the room, but with an opinion of their own. So we always had to make sure that every voice was heard when we were building. So if we move on to the questions themselves, first, and probably most obvious, is who are we designing for? Who is our user? So in the clinical trial space, we have several users. These are just a few examples. At the top there is the clinical research associate. These are the guys working mostly for contract research organizations that are making sure that the trial is run according to the protocol. So they are the people that have the working relationship with the medical team in every hospital. They visit them frequently to make sure that they address their needs, help them understand anything that the protocol demands that they might be trained on. Anything that has to do with the trial conduct, it's up to them to make sure that is running according to plan. Study managers are people who are in charge of the study overall. They're higher up in the hierarchy, and they need a much broader look of what's going on during the study. And then you've got biostatisticians, clinical staff in the sites that are participating in the study, and of course patients, right? So there are software tools of ours that are addressed to patients specifically. For the dashboard, we initially focused on the CRAs, right? So it made sense because these were the users that were closer to us, and also it was a good starting point because these guys interact with a fairly large range of the clinical trial software. So they don't. Maybe a biostatistician, for example, would focus more on any statistics or data analytics tool, but the CRAs need that broader understanding of a clinical trial. So we thought they were a good user to start with. As I said, in terms of their day-to-day, they are the people that interact with their clinical staff, and they are regularly on site conducting visit and ensuring quality and compliance. And their focus is primarily on data quality, data accuracy, and correct trial conduct. It's also interesting because they have little interaction with patients. Any information that they get from patients, they get either from the software or from the clinical team. So what is the problem we are solving, right? Do our users need a dashboard? And we felt like they did. As I said, they are exposed to many different sources of information from various different systems. So they use too many software tools, and they also have too many competing priorities. So a typical CRA might be looking after 20 or 30 participating sites in a clinical trial. So apart from spending a large part of their time in cars or airplanes, they also need to make sure that each site visit is is utilized to the extreme, right? So they don't have a lot of time to spare, and they also need to understand fairly quickly what their priorities are on any given day. Moving on to the sort of restrictions that we have before we even start building, or before we even get to a first set of requirements. For the dashboard, we had about 6 months to build. We obviously had a fixed budget. We had one team available to us, but more importantly, we had a fixed set of guidelines in terms of our UI and UX. And we also, had a strict requirement in terms of technology, right? We build enterprise software, so we can't just go shopping around to the sexiest technology that is out there before we take it through quite a strict process of qualification. So to establish that, you have to understand that we have to speak to a lot of internal stakeholders, architects, UX experts, you name it. So establishing where we are in terms of our technology starting point was not an easy task. What about the competition, right? So you have to look out there before you set a benchmark for yourself. So apart from the obvious sources of anything that's available in the public domain, I think it's really important to reach out to sales and look at RFPs. Because obviously RFPs are not a direct access to competition information, but it gives you a sense of what's out there. So especially for B2B companies that are looking for quality competition insights, RFPs are a good source of information. And the customers themselves, right? So salespeople tend to talk to customers a lot, and luckily enough, there are customers who are very vocal in expressing their opinions with respect to competitors. So it might be difficult to listen to that feedback, but it's so important to open your eyes and make sure that you bring it in and factor it in any design decisions. What about the long term, right? So what do we want our software to look like in 5 years time? We obviously want it to be scalable, especially in an ecosystem like the Medidata ecosystem, where we have 25, 30 products. We need it to be as scalable as possible. We need it to be supported by good technology, so that we don't just create tech debt for ourselves while we're building new tools. And we need it to be configurable. So for a dashboard, imagine that not just a clinical trials dashboard, but any dashboard, the users could be coming from any different background. Their job roles could be literally anything. So a mistake that we did in the beginning is that we started looking at a specific user archetype. We said, let's look at the CRA, which it wasn't necessarily a bad decision, but what we didn't do at that time is we didn't keep configurability at the back of our head. So we said, let's look at this user now, that user in the next release, the third user in the fourth, etc. But what we should have done is to look at how we could make the dashboard more configurable. And we eventually did, but this is one of the design decisions that I wish I could have done earlier. And lastly, development democratization. So what I mean by that is that if you imagine the dashboard is able to surface information from 10 different downstream products in 3 years' time, that would essentially sort of increase the need for resources that we would have as the dashboard application grew. So what we thought early on is that let's make it configurable enough and modular enough so that each team that wants to surface data on the dashboard can build their own dashboard component. And you'll see what that looks like in a minute. Are there any similar efforts in place, right? So nobody is happy if you step on their toes. So we need to make sure that there weren't any similar efforts out there. And guess what, right? There were. So there was no shortcut in the way that we could reuse, learn from, or as a worst case, discard what was already out there. So we had to go through a rigorous analysis of what was out there and reuse whatever we could. And finally, and probably most importantly, you always need to keep at the back of your mind what you're not building. So it's very easy to overwhelm yourself with scope. It's very easy to try and build a Swiss knife that does everything. And it's also very easy to duplicate functionality, especially in a company that has tools that are all in the same domain. And it's needless to say that it goes against human nature to try to complement, to try to prioritize, and to try to focus on what you think will have the most impact moving forward. So all those questions answered, this is what we ended up with, right? We wanted a single centralized location for all this data to be available in. We wanted our users to quickly establish their priorities and be able to drill down in the details. We wanted them to have a single place where they could just see key metrics about the stuff that they're interested in. We wanted the application to be signposting to other applications, right? We don't want them to spend too much time on the dashboard. We just want them to understand where they need to be going next. And we wanted them to provide the ability to do so very quickly. We've wanted it to be configurable. And of course, we wanted it to be scalable. So having a basic set of business requirements, how did we move on from there? We went to UX, and the designers were very quick to jump on board and and throw some mockups together. And funny as it may look, this is what they came up in one afternoon. And I cannot stress enough the importance of this little paper mockup here, right? In a matter of hours, we went from something that was just a bunch of bullet points in a presentation and an idea in a few people's heads onto something that we could actually look at. And this was a huge milestone in the process. And not only that, but it also helped us facilitate some of the more detailed conversations, right? We already knew that we were going to surfacing data based on business domains, and each widget or each little card on this paper mockup was its own entity, let's say. We could even discuss navigation because the navigational aspects are there, and even the data visualization elements, right? So once again, very important part in the journey. So that paper mockup quickly evolved into a lo-fi wireframe, and this is where we could start engaging more stakeholders in the discussions, and this also fed into the higher quality mockups, and there they are. Again, this is what we can now use for our development. This can be facilitating the story mapping, as it did, and also these are of the certain quality that you would go to your customers with. So we started the customer conversations with them. Having the mockups in place, we could now start the detailed analysis. So we started with 3 amigos sessions so that we don't take up the entire team's time. We put together some high-level stories and we sized them to get a feel of the effort required. We went through a first round of prioritization and scope refinement. Went on to put the stories in Jira. We took the entire team through them. We got the team level estimates, which were by far the most accurate estimate. Went again through a second round of prioritization and scope refinement. And finally, we could scope freeze, right? So especially for the clinical trials world, we need to be able to communicate what a release is going to include quite a few months back. So scope freezing early was important to us. Following that development process, this is what the end result looked like. Widgets from 4 downstream applications that are surfacing data on the dashboard. This is done via 5 independent widgets. We average about 2,000 to 2,500 page views a week, which is a good number given the age of the product and the fact that it's a business-to-business environment. And we are constantly adding applications and widgets, and we're also in the process of improving configurability so that users can have various different views. So as you can see, the elements of that paper mockup that was put together in a matter of hours are mostly there, and you'd be surprised at the similarities if we looked at into more detail. At the end of that process, if we had to go away with a few lessons learned, these would probably be them, right? So we spend a lot of time establishing our restrictions. So it would be good if we tried to level the playing field early on and made sure what we're building on and what our building components are. It's great if we could have focused on one persona. We did that mistake too. We focused on two user roles to begin with, and then scaled down to one, which made the whole conversation a lot easier. We visualized as soon as possible, right? So again, back to that paper mockup. This was a great a turning point in the whole process, and it helped facilitate a lot of the conversations afterwards. We did consult our users in the beginning. We could have done it more frequently, I suppose, but I think the takeaway was that maybe a bit contrary to what Agile says, where you go to your users at a more or less equal frequency. I'm a big fan of asking users early on in the process. So the more iterations, the more feedback sessions you have with users early on, the better it is, in my opinion. Maybe more importantly, you need to keep a balance of two things in mind while designing. You need to have that long-term vision, where you think big, you think what the product could look like in 5 years' time, while at the same time having that ability to ruthlessly prioritize and try to maintain a fairly small scope for your MVP. And with that, I'd like to thank you, and I hope you find that session interesting.